Welcome everybody. This is a Q&A session with myself, Jennifer Byrne. Ask me anything about biobanking. So just as people join, if you could jump on mute so that we don't have echoes. We are recording this session and we may or may not make this session, make the recording available, sort of depending on how it goes. It is an experiment in that we've never held these kinds of sessions before, so we just wanted to see whether there was interest from the biobanking community, and certainly if there is, we might do it again. What I might do, might just ask if someone else from the biobank could possibly let people in once I start sharing my slides. So I will look to share my slides. Hang on, I'm just going to get them up. There we go. Hang on. Geez, I'm terrible at this stuff. Okay, share. All right, hopefully you can see my slides. And what I might do is I'll go to the presentation mode, but then I won't be able to see the chat or the, I won't be able to see the chat. So if people, but you're certainly very welcome to put, questions in the chat, and I'll finish my presentation and then I'll come back to that. Okay, so, right, we are here to talk about, I think I'll just get rid of that. I don't know if I can get rid of that. I don't know. Sorry. I'll put that down there. There we are. All right. Yep, so this is myself. My name's Jennifer Byrne. I'm Director of Biobanking New South Wales Health, and I'm also a Professor at the University of Sydney. So these are my formerly Twitter handles. So the Biobank's on Twitter and I am as well. And I'm joining you today from the Statewide Biobank, which is based at Camperdown here in Sydney. And I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here at Camperdown. And I'd like to pay my respects to traditional custodians of the land and recognise that where we are meeting today has always been a site of teaching and learning and research. And so I'd like to welcome any Indigenous people, Aboriginal people that are present today. So just as a bit of introduction to myself, some of you might have seen this slide before, but I have been working in research for more than 35 years. I started out studying cortical plasticity as an honours student, and then I did my PhD in cancer predisposition and molecular genetics, which was something that I continued for many years. As a postdoctoral fellow, I identified human genes and started to learn about functional analysis of genes. And during really all of this time, I was involved in biobanking in some form or another, either helping to set up biobanks or using samples from biobanks. Around the same time, I started to actually study biobank operations from a research perspective and also study research integrity, which are my current interests. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the role of Director of Biobanking in New South Wales Health so that you can see what this role is supposed to be about. So I'm here to provide leadership to New South Wales Health biobanking programs. That includes the New South Wales Statewide Biobank, and to drive collaborations to achieve New South Wales Health's biobanking objectives and provide an improved service. Also here to lead an internal research direction within the biobank, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing there in a minute. And I'm here to lead and advocate for biobanking workforce planning and skills development, which is something I'm very passionate about. So most of my research currently is running through the University of Sydney through, we have 2 NHMRC Ideas grants where we aim to study publication and research integrity in medical research. So that's the name of our group, the Primer Group, and we are trying to improve the quality of the medical research literature and advocate for transformed publication standards and error correction capacity. And this is, of course, also in relation to biomedical research and the kinds of research that is supported by biobanks. So today I thought I'd start by discussing some of the questions that were submitted online. I think we had about 5 or 6 questions, so I thought I'd go through those. And then, of course, I'm very happy to receive other questions in real time. So if you could add those questions to the chat, because that also might help people who've got similar questions see that, maybe I could answer them together. And of course, throughout all of this, ideas and discussion are both very welcome. So while I'm presenting the answers to some of the questions, to all of the questions that we received online, people are welcome to jump off mute and, add anything that you'd like to say. So the first question that I received online, some of these questions were anonymous and some of them were named, but I won't indicate who submitted them. I think this was an anonymous question. One of the questions was, can researchers be notified if there is a rare sample available in a biobank to ensure the use of the sample is maximised? And I thought that was a really interesting question because, I'd never thought of that before. So the answer is, in theory, yes. Should probably consider a few things. Firstly, that where samples are very rare, there's an increased risk of revealing participant identity simply because these samples can often come from relatively few people. So that's something to consider. I think another thing that needs to be considered is the research utility of single samples from biobanks versus cohorts. Cohorts are generally more powerful. Of course, single samples can be used for certain kinds of research projects, but generally more power can be obtained through the cohort. And if samples are rare, another issue can be actually maintaining the researcher contact details, given that it might take, for example, years for the right sample to sort of appear. So I suppose how this could work is that researchers could register their interest with the biobank. I think that's something that could happen. And researchers could be notified probably when cohorts are pre-specified sample, pre-specified cohorts becomes available. I think there's a risk in handing over samples one by one to researchers because it could be that researchers then really aren't able to use those samples unless they're part of an informative cohort. Does anyone have any other comments on this question? I'm sorry, I can't see the chat. So if you do want to say something, just please, jump off mute. Otherwise, I can move on to the next one. This was a question specifically about the statewide biobank. So can biospecimens from the statewide biobank be recalled for diagnostic or treatment purposes of the participant? So that's also a good question. And I thought here I might give a bit of background to the statewide biobank and how the statewide biobank operates. So obviously there are many biobanks that are largely retrospective collections that are often designed around a particular disease or a research topic or something like that. But there's also the possibility of creating prospective collections, often to order, which has been referred to as contracting a biobank to create specimens. And then, of course, there's the possibility of researchers creating their own biobanks themselves. So the statewide biobank largely works through this contracting model. Most of our custodians actually work with the biobank to create a new biospecimen and data resource. So that means that at the statewide biobank, the samples, don't belong to the biobank. They are, they remain with the custodian. The biobank is merely looking after those samples, processing them, storing them, that kind of thing. So if a sample did need to be recalled for diagnostic or treatment purposes, then it would really be up to the custodian to make that call and request a sample from the statewide biobank as per any other retrieval request. So we wouldn't have any say in whether or not that sample should be recalled. That's a decision for the custodian according to the scope of their human research ethics approval. And I think if something is actually required for clinical use, most biobanks allow that. Certainly when I was at the Children's Hospital at Westmead, the tumour bank there would sometimes receive requests because the only samples that were available for retesting of patients, for example, if they were diagnosed with second malignancies or if they relapsed, often in some cases the sample that would be available would be within the biobank. So the statewide biobank would simply comply with the retrieval request as we would for any other retrieval request. Any comments on this question? All right. Yeah. So I think just at this point, I did want to flag a few misconceptions about the statewide biobank that I have heard over the years. So we do really need to stress that the ownership of the biospecimens and data remain with the collection custodian, and all of this is according to their HREC approval. So we store samples, but we don't own them, and we never share them without the custodian's express permission, and we don't perform research on stored samples or data. We only carry out QC analyses, and all of this is in accordance with our own human research ethics approval, which we have as a biobank. All right, so the next question, this is an interesting one. Okay, I've paraphrased a little bit of the wording, but basically the question says there's 6 local health districts in Sydney, 15 across New South Wales, each with their own human research ethics committee. So it's essentially saying that, you know, different HRECs may be applying different standards to biobanking, which can lead to disparities in the level of service that biobanks can offer to their research communities. The question is really what could be done to standardise decisions about HREC approvals for biobanking across different HRECs within New South Wales. And would the Statewide Biobank be well positioned to lead this? So the answer is to the question as to whether the Statewide Biobank would be in a position to lead this, I would say that that's the case. And we actually have been working on this issue because it's something that I've been aware of for many years. Before talking about that, though, I really need to point out that standardisation, particularly across individual HRECs, is obviously desirable, but yet quite difficult to achieve. The reasons for this, from speaking with HRECs, is that some human research ethics committees actually very rarely receive biobanking applications. Some of them don't necessarily have biobank kind of dedicated people on their committees. Some do have that, but some don't. And so generally when a committee doesn't often receive applications around a particular kind of research, they can find those more difficult to, I guess, review. The other issue that I've heard from HREC chairs is that some biobanking applications are actually hard to understand and therefore assess. So I've met with both individual HREC chairs and also groups of HREC chairs to talk about this issue, the issue particularly of how HRECs should deal with applications to create new biobanks. I've provided a document that was developed more than 10 years ago by the University of Sydney that can provide some guidance around requirements for new biobank creation, and I'll talk about that in a second. And I think that that could perhaps help to increase the standardisation of application requirements around biobanks that could be communicated to applicants. So this is the document that the University of Sydney developed, I think in 2012, and I'm not sure that it is in current use, but it's certainly a very strong document, and that it very clearly outlines what would be expected to establish a new tissue bank. And we can go into that a little bit more in a bit more detail during the talk, but it does consider the rationale for, you know, why, for example, the biobank needs to be created, how it's going to be governed, what's the budget, where is the money coming from, is there going to be cost recovery, and very importantly, contingency planning should funding become unavailable, and how the tissue and the data should be managed if funding is discontinued and the biobank can no longer operate. Okay, so what applicants can do, and this is feedback that I've had from Human Research Ethics Committee chairs, is if a study is going to create a new biobank, make this very clear, because sometimes I understand that biobanking can be embedded in research proposals, and it's not really clear whether this is a research study, whether it's a research study with a new biobank, or whether it's really about a new biobank. And if a new biobank is to be created, it's very helpful to explain whether alternatives to biobank creation have been considered and why they're not appropriate. I think it's particularly helpful to focus upon local biobanks, because those would be the biobanks that any new biobank might be expected to partner with or merge, at least from a sort of a geographic proximity point of view. It's important to justify or explain how any new biobank will be funded and sustained over time, And also, if you can pre-specify wind down and closure processes, that can save a lot of difficulty in, 5 or so years when people might be looking at this. Sorry, any questions on this aspect, this question? Issues with HREX? I mean, we can always discuss these later, So I think this is the second last question. So this is around, I guess, the New South Wales Health Statewide Consent Toolkit, which was a toolkit for consenting participants for biobanking that was developed some years ago and before I joined New South Wales Health Pathology. So it states here correctly that the toolkit provides for some targeted materials for specific cases of biobanking, paediatric biobanks. The question is, are there plans to expand the toolkit to include resources, consent forms and participant information sheets directed at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities? Or are there resources at biobanks in New South Wales that can be used as guidance when setting up community consultations and engagement strategies? So the answer that I have here is that there aren't any short-term plans to expand the consent toolkit because this is largely an issue of resourcing. Putting the toolkit together took a great deal of time and involved a lot of individual people. I think at the time when the consent toolkit was developed, it was envisaged that the statewide biobank would play a major role in consenting participants. But actually, the model of our operation means that because we're working with custodians, it's the custodians that actually consent the patients for individual studies. And obviously, this is a better ethical model because the custodians have a research relationship with their patient groups. But this also means that because the statewide biobank doesn't actually consent patients, we're not experts in consent. So we certainly wouldn't be the people that would be, I think, overhauling the consent toolkit because we lack that expertise here. We are experts in, a number of things, but consent is probably not one of them, certainly speaking from a personal perspective. However, I think what we can do is we can seek out appropriate resources elsewhere and make those available. There are a number of national initiatives that are focusing on Aboriginal health, genomics, precision medicine, and I have no doubt that those initiatives being specialised in that field will have probably the best kinds of resources that would be available. But we could seek out those resources and put those up and make those available on our website. All right, I might go through. Oh, yes, sorry, yes.
Sorry to interrupt, it's Amanda Rush. I just wanted to add there that at the time that toolkit was developed, it was actually reviewed closely by the Centre for Aboriginal Health, which is part of the Ministry of Health. So they did have input into it. That's not to say that it was specifically for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, but certainly the content in there was approved by that group. I'm not sure if they have their own website that may have some resources that might be useful as well.
Oh, thanks, Amanda. And I know that you were very closely involved with the development of the toolkit, so I appreciate you providing that information. That's good to know. But I think the toolkit didn't include specific resources for consenting, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander patients.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. Any other comments? All right, I'll go to the last question. I can't remember why I put that in. I think this was to sort of make the point that a biobank's a facility, whereas biobanking is a process, and a lot of processes around biobanking, such as consenting, often don't actually take place within the biobank. So I think discussions and resourcing around consent really needs quite broad input. So this is the last question. This is about sustainability. So again, it's I've edited the question a little bit. It's basically says, there's been, at times there's been funding for the establishment of biobanks and then funding droughts. And obviously sustainability is a big issue for biobanking in Australia and elsewhere. And there have been closure of biobanks which can hold large collections of samples. So how do you see end-of-life practices, particularly in New South Wales, continuing? How can they be managed to ensure that biospecimens are stored appropriately and remain accessible for research and don't become increasingly burdensome for the remaining biobanks that have agreed to take on these samples? And also thinking about data as well. So yes, very good question. I think a key issue in this slide, which is one of my slides, really highlights this, is that there's always within biobanking been very limited discussion around the processes around biobanking, wind down and closure. We're much more comfortable about talking about setting up new biobanks, how we operate biobanks, how we expand biobanks, but we're much less comfortable about talking about biobank closure, and yet inevitably that is something that will happen to many biobanks. So as a result, biobank closures are generally poorly planned, and it's interesting that there's a few papers in the literature about biobank closures, and they're usually sort of forensic dissections of what went wrong, as opposed to talking about, well, you know, how this could be done better. There are a couple of those papers. So it is important to make a plan, preferably at the outset, that does include samples and data around what will happen to those samples and data if the biobank needs to close. And obviously it's difficult to predict all of those elements, but I think there needs to be some thinking around that as early as possible. This is because most biobanks, and the statewide biobank is included, we aren't resourced to take on legacy or abandoned collections because it can be very expensive, particularly where biobanks are very large. And I think another thing that I have sort of seen in my career is that for a biobank to take over an existing collection, there really needs to be a research active custodian who remains at the helm, who can encourage the research use of these samples. Otherwise, it's very likely that the samples are just going to sit in their new location and they will never be used. It's really the past research use of a collection that can predict future research use. And while some people sort of liken biospecimens to wine, you know, the data can mature and the value of this biospecimens can accumulate, the opposite can also happen. Older biospecimens that may have been derived from patients treated through protocols that are no longer current can actually have a use by date that they can reach very quickly. So ongoing storage of collections simply because they are large doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be valuable from a research perspective in the future. The best way of keeping a collection alive is to make sure that there is a research active custodian, but sometimes when funds have run out or people are retiring or moving on, that's not possible. So we are currently writing a manuscript on this topic, on the topic of how to make decisions about whether collections are retained in biobanks or prioritised for being discarded. But because it's a difficult topic, I think it's going to take us a little while to really work on to get that going. Again, so this request for approval for a tissue bank at the University of Sydney does clearly request for contingency planning if funding becomes unavailable and a description of what's going to happen to the tissue if the biobank discontinues. So in terms of biobank sustainability, I think what we have been advocating for as a long time is an evidence-based approach to biobank sustainability. So we really need to understand, firstly, what researchers want in terms of biobanking services so that those services can be provided. And we also need to understand better about what biobanks actually contribute to research. So this study was led by Amanda Rush as part of her PhD, and we did a national survey of what biomedical researchers want from biobanks. And the two things that matter the most are cost and time, essentially. So the speed with which researchers can obtain their samples and how much they're going to pay in terms of cost recovery. We've also talked about some ways in which biobanks can become more sustainable through this commentary that was published, I think, in 2021 during COVID. And Amanda has another publication that's in press at the moment that will be coming out soon, which is the result of a study of the costs and outputs of a cohort of academic biobanks here in New South Wales, which provides information about how much actual cash it costs to run biobanks, what proportion of their operating costs come from in-kind support and the value of that in-kind support, and what publications were produced by the cohort and the nature of those publications. So I think once that publication's out, we hope that that will provide a resource as well for biobanks to allow them to calculate their costs more closely because we've included the costing model that Amanda developed within that manuscript as a tool for biobanks to use. All right, so now we can jump into real-time discussion. So I just want to encourage people to say that your ideas and discussion are very welcome. And before I leave, I just want to acknowledge my team here at the Statewide Biobank, particularly Candice Carter, our operations manager, and thank OHMR and the New South Wales Health Pathology and also the Cheryl, and of course funding from New South Wales Health. So I'm going to stop sharing. Geez, I hope. There we are. Okay.
Hey,
I'm
Jenny.
back. I'm back.
We received a question from
Yes.
Amanda. And her question was, do you think there is appetite for a harmonised national biobanking approach?
Geez, I wish there was. Yes. Yes, that's also something that we've been working on for a long time. And I have to say, without a lot of success. We have been working on that through the National Research Infrastructure planning process, which involves the derivation and publishing of roadmaps for national research infrastructure investments. And that I think we first became involved in that process in 2016. And for the last two roadmaps, the roadmap has mentioned the importance of biobanking initially in 2016 and then biobanking and collections in 2021. But during, basically in 2016, there was a scoping study that was funded but never took place. In 2021, there have been consultations that have taken place to some extent but seem to have stalled. So there have been a number of milestones that should have been met in terms of release of documentation from an initial national consultation that I think wrapped up almost a year ago. To my best knowledge, the documents from that consultation haven't been released. So I think it seems as if, unfortunately, people for some reason think that a national approach to biobanking is too difficult, when actually those of us in biobanking view this as really quite simple because the infrastructure already exists. It's simply a matter of providing a kind of a layer of oversight and connecting the existing resources as opposed to building something completely from scratch. I don't know whether anyone else has got any comments on that, but so in terms of what's happening, fortunately, I'm still part of the discussions around INCRIS. And there is a meeting coming up, I think, in about a couple of weeks that I will be going to. And at those meetings, I always ask about the status of the biobanking work and when documents will be released. But it is concerning that deadlines have been repeatedly, proposed dates by when things will be available have not been met. I'm just going to, yep, thanks. So I think what can we do? I think as a community, when there are opportunities to consult on national biobanking, and I know that ABNA has been really supportive of this and playing a leadership role, that it's very important for the community to show their willingness to consult and engage and stress the importance of a national approach for biobanking. All right, thank you. I can see a couple of questions in the chat. So Karen's asked, could the New South Wales Biobank play a leadership role in reducing duplication, improving the efficiency of collections? Yes, Karen, that is true. We can and we do. I think I'm going to break that down into a couple of points. So one of the main ways that we looked at reducing duplication, improving efficiency of collections is through our certification program. So the certification program was started in around 2016, and that's still I think it's the only it's kind of like a light touch certification program through education that's available within New South Wales. We adopted a certification scheme from Canada, and an important feature of that certification scheme is a biobank registry. So the biobank registry that we have at the Statewide Biobank is still the only registry that I'm aware of in New South Wales. It was the first registry of its kind in Australia. There are now a couple of registries in other parts of the country, which is great. But a very important part of having a registry is so that biobanks are visible, so people can actually see what biobanks we have, and people can see where there might be more than one biobank that's supporting a particular kind of collection. I suppose in terms of the biobank playing a leadership role, that is somewhat challenging because really we don't have any authority in terms of dictating which biobanks are created, and how biobanks behave. There is a strong, I would say, biobank creation fulfills a lot of the innate desires of researchers to be autonomous, to have resources that they can use and they can control. And actually telling people not to open biobanks or not to create new biobanks is not a message that most researchers want to hear when they actually have a biobank. So we have also led projects in the past where we've had funding from the Cancer Institute New South Wales to encourage biobanks to partner together, particularly small biobanks and large biobanks, which could be a prelude towards biobanks merging. But again, actually, getting biobanks to sort of make change is quite a difficult thing to do. So probably one of the best ways of doing this is through, I think, more judicious creation of new biobanks, of raising awareness amongst researchers that they don't always have to create a new biobank if they want samples, that they can work with existing biobanks, that they can think about creating a new collection within a biobank or creating a new biobank that's part of something larger. And I think all of these things can achieve economies of scale and save funds. And I'm happy to hear any other comments on that. Thanks, Candice, for putting in the link to the certification program. Karen, did that kind of answer your question?
Sorry about that.
That's helpful. I guess as a second, and this is definitely not a biobank within the authority, but it's more about having less all these siloed collections that might not be in biobank. They might be just in clinical spaces, or anyway, there's so many different ones, and each time, we ask participants to donate, for example, to the 45 and up study, I think, well, I wonder how many have already donated somewhere else. And you don't want to burden participants, and it would be much better for researchers across Australia nationally to be able to access either the derived data or the actual biospecimens to get new derived data from them. Anyway, it's a very big question.
Yeah, look, you're right, Karen, and I think there's questions of burdens on participants, but there's also scientific issues as well. So one of the things that I did before joining New South Wales Health Pathology was I established a national network of paediatric cancer biobanks. And one of the main reasons to do that is because, of course, paediatric cancer is very rare. People are diagnosed by definition when they're children. Because of a strong, genetic predisposition plays a big role in childhood cancer by definition. And that means, unfortunately, that some children are diagnosed with more than one cancer as children. And of course, people and families move around. So that can mean that patients can donate to different biobanks, either through their participation in particular clinical studies or because they move. And that fragmentation can actually lead to the appearance of more patients than actually exist. So, for example, there might be two biobanks that hold a sample from the same patient, and they might think that they're just different cases, but of course they're not. And if you include those cases as independent cases in any cohort, then you're actually undermining the integrity of your scientific analysis. So it is actually important, while protecting participant identity, to actually know what samples are in biobanks and where there are overlaps and duplicates. To actually know that. Not knowing that is a real scientific risk. So I guess another thing, that we've done in the past and that can be useful, again, creation of biobank networks can allow those kinds of things to be more visible. But And
I
again,
wonder-
I think probably increasing awareness amongst researchers of the potential for obtaining samples from biobanks and the need to perhaps do their own due diligence on what they obtain from biobanks. You know, there are some simple tests that people can do on samples to determine whether or not they're from the same person without compromising the identity of those people.
I guess just as a last comment, you know, we've over the years finally developed in most states in Australia MLKs for linking administrative data. It would be amazing to have something similar for genomic data across Australia. And I think that would require systematic change where, whether it's MRFF or NHMRC funding, where this was actually something that actually was at a national level, almost imposed to try and make this whole system more efficient.
Yeah, I
Anyway,
think that
just a
that's
thought.
true. I think that's also true. We probably need, again, from experience of data linkage here at the Statewide Biobank, there's also a big sort of education piece for researchers as well. I mean, a lot of people that use biospecimens are not experts in data linkage, and they need support in order to sort of embrace that capacity. And that's something that we've held, for example, a seminar here a couple of years ago. We had two people from the Cheryl actually talking about data linkage opportunities at the Statewide Biobank to help people understand what opportunities exist. And I know that there are similar sorts of education opportunities organised regularly. But again, this is kind of a cultural change that also needs to happen in the research community. And of course, in many cases, researchers struggle to get funding for their research, and they won't have those additional funds necessarily to allow data linkage. But I think your suggestion of that sort of being a requirement and that requirement being supported by money is very important.
Yes. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you. I'm just going to go through the questions. I've got a question from Brodie talking about the primer group. Yes, research reproducibility and quality certainly has been an ongoing issue. Do I believe that standards and accreditation can be used for improving this? Yes, the quick answer is yes, we do. And that's why many years ago, we were very keen to introduce the certification program to New South Wales. So that was based upon some of our very early research with cancer biobanks here in New South Wales. So bearing in mind that this research was done nearly 10 years ago, at the time we interviewed a cohort of biobanks, and some biobanks at the time were not using standard operating procedures. There were low rates of dedicated staff education and training. Many biobanks were not able to send people to conferences so that they could learn about best practices. So that's one of the reasons why the certification system is designed to be accessible to anybody. Anybody can register. Anybody can download all of the resources that are available through those programs, which involves standard operating procedure templates and things like that. So definitely, I think, of course, since then we now have an ISO standard for biobanking, ISO 20387. I think there's a couple of biobanks in the country that have been accredited to that standard. So the Statewide Biobank's accredited to ISO 9001, which is a general quality standard. I think intrinsically most people think that paying better attention to quality will improve the quality of samples that biobanks can produce and the reliability of the research that's based on those. I don't think there's any evidence, there's no actual evidence published to say that, but I think intrinsically the reason why most organisations rely on accreditation because they feel that it's, you're better off doing it. I mean, I don't think I'd want to go to a hospital that's not accredited, and but actually in terms of asking researchers, did they value accreditation status of their biobank when we actually did our researcher survey? That was one of the features of biobanks that researchers cared about the least. So that was actually a little bit shocking to us. We were kind of hoping that biobank users would say, oh, yes, we value certification accreditation. No, that wasn't true. I think that often what researchers value is speed and costs. Perhaps arguably that makes it all the more important for biobanks to choose to follow those kinds of systems themselves. Did you have any other questions, Brodie?
No, that was really good. Thank you. I had, we've been trying to get this information for quite a while, and I had a feeling that would that would be the case. And obviously cost is a huge factor when it comes to certification and accreditation. And as you know, research fields one are already struggling with costs as it is. So going through the process and the time taken, I know it can be difficult, but we were just interested to see how valued, I guess, that was by research groups. So that is good to know. Just the second half of the question that I put in there was in regards to ethics applications. So I'm just wondering if ethics applications are ever considered, I guess, of benefit to have any sort of certification accreditation status within the applications, or ethics and or grant applications?
That's a good question. I know that that was done in Canada. I don't think so much as ethics, but I'm pretty sure that the biobank certification scheme in Canada was then linked to researchers' ability to request funding to use biobanks. So certain schemes in Canada would only provide funding for researchers if they were using a biobank that had been certified. As far as I know, Canada, I think that's still continuing, but I'm not aware of that happening elsewhere. We'd certainly thought about that here in Australia. I mean, ideally, it would be fantastic if organisations such as the NHMRC recognise the value of certification. I mean, funders obviously have a big lever to pull in terms of making change. We've talked about the certification scheme to ethics committees in the past. So, but of course, one of the issues is that, you know, ethics committees are overwhelmed with information, and they're, you know, you might present this, but they may or may not remember that sort of information a couple of years later. But just on the point of certification, certification is a very low cost scheme. When we first introduced it, it was free because it was supported by the Cancer Institute New South Wales. People are still free to register for the scheme, but if you actually do certify your biobank, we asked for a very low sort of nominal fee to cover those costs. But yeah, certainly accrediting to an ISO standard such as ISO 9001, ISO 20387, one of the issues is that there are costs involved with that, not only in terms of personnel, but also in the actual process. And I think those costs are probably beyond the capability of many biobanks, particularly small biobanks, to pay at the moment.
Yeah, thank you for that.
No, thank you. Oh, I've got a question here from Terry about MTAs. Okay, I'm involved in a biobanking project involving RPAH. The MTA has all sites mentioned as participating sites, but do individual sites each require a separate MTA with a biobank, please? Oh, Lord. Look, I don't know is my answer. But I mean, this is also something that, you know, I think MTAs can become burdensome when all the different sites request individual modifications to MTAs. There are universal MTAs that have been derived, and a lot of institutions have signed up for those. But I think for this, I mean, one of the ways that the biobank has gotten around this issue of sites requesting MTAs to be modified is basically our MTAs are not for discussion. They are the content of the MTA set by health pathology, and people either sign or don't sign. So sometimes taking those fairly strong approaches can reduce the time that's spent often on very minor modifications to MTAs. So I think that what I'd advise is propose an MTA and indicate that this is the MTA and people just have to sign it. It has worked here.
Thank you.
No worries. Good luck. Yes. Thank you. I think this is a comment from Brendan saying NADA has an interesting session coming up at its accreditation matters with Professor Dan Catchpool talking about new standards for biobanking and presenting ISO 20387. That's correct. And I think that I'm pretty sure that for anybody attending the ISBA conference, which is the biobanking conference in Melbourne, I think that there's also a presentation on ISO 20387 at that conference as well. I'm wondering whether any of the biobanks online is anybody working towards ISO 20387? maybe, maybe not. Yes. The biobank at the biobank here, where as I mentioned, we've been accredited for a couple of years to ISO 9001. And if people have got questions about that process, we're very happy to, talk to you about that. Okay, I can see another question. Yes, of course, Marta. Yes, I know you are accredited to ISO 20387. I know. I think you were the first. Were you the first in the world? I think you might have been.
Yes,
So
we were.
you
Thank you,
were.
Jen.
I know. I've seen you present on that. Yes, yes. I think in Australia there might be one or two. I think Victoria Biobanking is accredited to ISO 20387. I'm not sure whether there are others. I think there's a couple of others that are working towards it. But even, for a statewide biobank such as ourselves, I know that, complying to ISO 9001 is still a significant, it's a significant effort for us. And I think the issue for dedicated staff to really allow that to happen is something that most biobanks are going to find potentially challenging in today's funding environment, at least. Does anyone else have any other questions or anything that they would like to discuss? What about anything that I talked about earlier on? I'm sorry for sort of presenting slides and then jumping out. Any other questions on biobank sustainability? Any topics that I just thought I'd mention as well? So this seminar is part of our external biobanking seminar series. So I'm very happy to receive suggestions of topics that people would like to discuss. So if people would either like to present on topics, or if you think that there's a particular topic in biobanking that we should be addressing through our seminar series, I'm happy to hear from you. I think we could look to organise, for example, a seminar on biobank sustainability and perhaps get a couple of different people talking to that topic. But one of the reasons why we hold these seminars is by recognising that often, again, from our research in the past, we know that biobanks often don't have a lot of funds for education and conferences, and so our seminars are free. We record them. They're all available on a YouTube channel, which I will put into the chat. And I think it's a service that we can provide to the community that's of low cost, that can actually help people, I guess, just have the opportunity to talk about biobanking and current issues. So I'm going to put that into the chat so people can see where our previous seminars are. But yeah, certainly if you've got suggestions of things that you'd like to talk about, just send me an email. I'll put my email in the chat as well. And I think we've got some interesting talks coming up this year. I'm just going to have a look. I'm going to have to turn around and actually read my own program. Hang on, I'll put my, geez, what is my email address? It's a .gov, isn't it? God, okay, there we are. Okay, you can email me. Yeah, we've got a talk coming up on crossover between biobanks and clinical registries, which I'm looking forward to. We've got Cassandra Griffin from the University of Newcastle talking about brain biobanking. And we also have a presentation about the National Organoid Centre, which is a project around organoid development, which is obviously potentially a new area of where biobanks can get involved. So look, if we don't have any other questions, I'm happy for people to ask questions, but if we don't, we might give people 10 minutes back in their day. Thanks to everybody who dialed in, and to people who ask questions online and in person. And certainly we can organise these kinds of events in the future, maybe do it once a year. Basically, we're here to provide support to the biobanking community, and we're really committed to offering you the support that you feel that you need. So don't hesitate to reach out, write to me if you've got ideas about things that we should be doing or things that you need help with. We are here to help. Thank you very much to Mike Evtushenko and also Caesar for helping organising the session. And it's great to see you all online, and hopefully see some of you at ISBA in person, and otherwise drop me an email. Thanks, everyone.